Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Madeline De Delfa, and I am the Assistant Director of Programs and Community Engagement at the Rose Art Museum. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight with my wonderful colleague Yasmin Vera, our museum educator, to give a special presentation of a few of the works included in the exhibition Fabricated Imaginaries Crafting Art, which was curated by Dr. Ganit Ancori, the Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator of the Rose. This exhibition, which is on view through May 31st, brings together over 30 works of art from around the globe that challenge categories, dissolve hierarchies, and expand our understanding of what art is and can be.
Each of these incredible artworks is in dialogue with contemporary issues around activism, protest, witness, and truth-telling. We come to this conversation on the heels of the Fall of Freedom, a weekend-long activation of arts organizations and workers across the country this past November. We hosted a tour around these artworks as part of that activation, and we continue this conversation with you all today, not just in the spirit of the many artists and arts workers who initiated this act of protest, but also in the spirit of the founding values of Brandeis in our museum. Guided by these values of inclusion, social justice, and critical inquiry, we are very excited to dig into each of these artworks with you all today. To that end, we also invite you to ask any questions or leave any observations in the Q&A so that we can all be part of this conversation. And we are going to start with this piece by Nick Cave titled Sound Suit. This is one of more than 500 suits he has made since he first began this series in 1991. Cave initiated the Sound Suit series in response to the beating of Rodney King, an act of police brutality that would end up nationally televised after it was caught on camera by a bystander. On an art historical note, this video would later be played at the 1993 Whitney Biennial, highlighting its unprecedented nature, a violent act captured and catapulted to the attention of the nation. Following the acquittal of the police officers who assaulted King, this video itself embodied and stoked the racial tensions already embedded within American society. For Cave, he saw himself in Rodney King. Also a young Black man, he knew that in many ways, when he left his home, he too could easily become another profile. When sitting in the park one day reflecting on this very personal feeling of being dismissed, discarded, and viewed as less than, he saw a twig and found inspiration, creating a suit out of this found, devalued object, concealing himself in the rustling sound of the wood. That first suit reminded him of the role of protest, and that in order to be heard, you sometimes have to speak louder. Likewise, it was a way of alarming others to his presence. Speaking of the sound suits, Nick Cave actually says, that woke my consciousness. That's when I became an artist with a civic responsibility and began looking at my work as a social practice. We can see that the sound suits do not just mediate an injustice in our society, but also call attention to it. Looking at this sound suit today, we can see several eye-catching qualities to the work. It is highly decorative, with glittering yarn, plastic baubles and faux pearls, intricate glimmering beadwork, and dense sequening. As we move from the bottom of the sculpture to the top, the colors shift from blue to red to white, and then finally to black on the inside of the headpiece. This headpiece extends out into our space, physically preventing us, physically preventing us from getting too close, covering half of the figure. Though resembling something made out of plant fiber, it is also entirely made out of beads. Inside, the beading continues with floral motifs, and the face of the person is masked and covered, the only part of their body that is exposed being the hands and the heels. Even with the eyes obscured, there is a sense that the sound suit is watching or witnessing. The dominant white colors evoke mourning, death, purity, and spiritual cleansing, while the trio of red, white, and blue have their obvious analog in the American flag. The exposed parts of the body call to mind vulnerability, the Achilles heel, or the use of hand gestures to communicate. The sound suit hides, but is also highly adorned in ways that catch the light and call to mind performative spaces like ceremonies or costuming, fashion, and entertainment. Cave was actually originally trained in fiber arts and dance, and the sculptural forms of the sound suit merged these two disciplines. Like that original twig, he uses found materials that are commonly devalued as low, gaudy, or frivolous. Craft traditions are often part and parcel of women's work. So we see that there are certain distinctions made between art and craft based on biases around gender, race, and class, often without accounting for the aesthetic or technical value. For instance, when we look at this dense sequencing, all of it hand sewn, this would have taken a lot of fine skill and time in order to create a real labor of love. For Cave, this is also perhaps a call to the woman in his family, such as his aunts who were seamstresses and his grandmother who was a quilter, each creating these really elaborate textiles out of spare means. He is also actually calling into this artwork the idea of flamboyance, referencing Black dandyism as well as queerness. He drew early inspiration as a teenager from the Ebony Fashion Fair. In the era of Ebony and Jet magazine, the style, power, and glamour of Black celebrity was growing. He translate this he translates this into the spectacle of the sound suit, which renegotiates the hypervisibility of the Black body into a means of joyful self-articulation. So the sound suit is both a second skin that exposes the problems of racial profiling, discrimination, prejudice, and isolation, while seemingly shedding it, turning towards exuberance, self-expression, community, space-taking, and autonomy. With the creative mode of the sound suit, Cave encourages us to find ourselves in this conversation and provides a strategy for resilience in the face of brutality. Rather than turning away or into despair, he creates a path towards joy and hope.
And I just want to say that while many of the pieces in Fabricated Imaginaries are part of the Rose's permanent collection, we did get several important loans for this exhibition, including this piece, which is from the Green Family Foundation, courtesy of Adam Green Art Advisory. So we just want to say thank you. And Yasmin, I'm not sure if we got any questions while you were talking.
No, not yet, but if anybody has any observations or questions, please feel free to send them along as we're talking.
But Yasmin, I really love the detail that you shared about Nick Cave's grandmother being a quilter and his aunts being seamstresses, because these themes of family legacies and craft traditions being passed down from foremothers is found in so many of these artworks, including this next piece by Jeffrey Gibson. This is By Any Means Necessary from 2021. This piece is part of the Roses permanent collection. Um, and this piece is from Gibson's series of quilt block paintings. Gibson says, quote, "My grandmothers made quilts and I collect quilts. I'm drawn to their patchwork quality. If you know where the fabrics are coming from, there's a story that can be played out through material culture." So you can see that the composition of this piece resembles a quilt. And here, Gibson's multimedia quilt serves as a visual counterhistory of European colonialism in America. Gibson, a member of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians and of Cherokee descent, resists mainstream American narratives which have historically delegitimized Indigenous identities, worldviews, and history in favor of romantic, idealized stereotypes. Looking at the installation view from Fabricated Imaginaries, we have Jean Shin's alterations here in the foreground. We see that this piece, Gibson's piece, is flanking a 19th century Diné blanket, and along the same wall is Murray Watt's beaded pennant Forerunner from 2020. So again, as I mentioned, this idea of foremothers, Forerunner is also looking at the original foremother, Sky Woman. We immediately notice the bright colors, the use of strong geometric patterns, and diagonal compositions. Looking closer, we notice that a painting is reproduced along one diagonal right here. This figure is right here. This figure is here. These figures can be found here. And then finally, this right side of the composition, the figures can be found here. Gibson is referencing an early 20th century painting titled The Abduction of Pocahontas by Jean-Léon Jerome Ferris, which is in the collection of the Virginia Historical Society. So here Gibson is quite literally deconstructing 20th century narratives of European contact with Native Americans. Also along the diagonal, we notice block text that spells out the piece's title, By Any Means Necessary. I enlarged it so you can see By Any Means Necessary, which perhaps evokes manifest destiny and European imperialism. The phrase, by any means necessary, was popularized by Malcolm X in a 1964 speech to the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He said, quote, "We want freedom by any means necessary. We want justice by any means necessary. We want equality by any means necessary." In this speech, Malcolm X is also talking about collective self-creation unity, and finding pride in one's identity. We also see in this same block text, just be good to me and run away with me. Song lyrics from house music and pleading romantic tones. This stands in contrast to the demands of by any means necessary. So the fantasy of Pocahontas's romantic abduction is punctured by demands of freedom, justice, and sovereignty. This geometric text, which resembles quilt blocks, can be hard to decipher initially. It's always really fun to look at this piece with viewers and kind of watch them try to puzzle out exactly what this says. That helps the viewer viscerally understand the loss of indigenous languages and alphabets. But Gibson's artwork, importantly, moves beyond loss and into creation. He says, quote, I think growing up feeling as though my cultural inheritance was one of only traumatic despair is problematic for my own survival. So I just had to find ways of seeing our histories as being living and strong and capable. This piece also includes vintage whimsies, beading, and acrylic paint. Through these material, Gibson's counters colonial myths about contact with indigenous populations, the history of tourism, and its impact on Native American cultural production, distinction between fine arts and craft, and the visual language of modernism. The whimsy on the left would likely have been a pincushion, again referencing craft traditions, and the whimsy on the right was perhaps a belt buckle. Both would have been created and sold as souvenirs. Notably, they both include American flags and overtly patriotic imagery. These vintage pieces represent a long history of nation building and the crafting of American identity. These whimsies, designed by Gibson, include a mouthless red face, a black and white patterned frowning face. And the rainbow color palette references Gibson's queer identity, as well as indigenous weaving patterns. Gibson has said that when he was in art school, his professors criticized his use of color as gaudy, trashy, kitschy, and campy. But as a queer and indigenous artist, Gibson creates his own artistic vocabulary outside the white, male-dominated Eurocentric and heteronormative art historical canon. Gibson has said, quote, I don't identify as a frontline activist, but we are all politicized for how we are seen. We are also advocating for our political selves, and those political selves are rooted in our ancestry and our heritages.
I think that the way in which our identities are politicized can at many times be entirely out of our own hands. However, there is power in advocating for yourself along political lines and recognizing yourself as a political actor, especially in contrast to longstanding narratives of marginality and misrepresentation. And with that, we're actually going to move on to an artwork by the artist Tuesday Smillie titled Street Transvestites 1973. Um, and as you saw, it's kind of in that top gallery surrounded by other large works, kind of resembling banners. So yeah, you can kind of get a nice little view here of it in conversation with the Nick Cave as well. So Tuesday Smillie is another artist who is working along these same lines of witness, care, and protest. This work directly references STAR, or Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, a group founded by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, two queer liberationist luminaries who are nowadays more well known for their actions in Stonewall. These two women founded this group in particular to attend to the needs of trans people of color, particularly Black and Brown trans women who worked and lived on the street. STAR began in 1970, growing out of the student activist occupation of Weinstein Hall at NYU, which itself was spurred by the cancellation of gay dances by the administration. From there, STAR went on to provide housing, food, and community support to at-risk and houseless youth. STAR was affiliated with other liberationist groups, including the Gay Liberation Front, the Young Lords, and the Black Panther Party, working in coalition with others across a wide variety of topics such as Medicaid, AIDS outreach and research, supplemental security income, welfare services, prison abolition, and more. This artwork makes a direct reference to one of STAR's activities at the 1973 Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade. Although STAR was invited to march, they were physically prevented from entering the march, had their banner taken down, and members of the crowd even attempted to remove STAR from the vicinity physically. Sylvia Rivera would go on to give an impassioned speech about this exclusion and attempted removal at the parade, highlighting the clear motivating force of transmisogyny and the sentiment that there was a growing divide between privileged queer activists and the most vulnerable members of the community. And we're actually going to play you the clip of an excerpt of her words now.
Y'all better quiet down. I've been trying to get up here all day for your gay brothers and your gay sisters in jail. They're right me every motherfucking week. And you all don't do a goddamn thing for them. I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? The people that are trying to do something for all of us and not men and women that belong to a white middle class, white club. And that's what you all belong to. Revolution now!
So, in creating this artwork, Smillie was thinking not only of the backlash that STAR members faced while they were active, but also of STAR's omission from queer history and her own attempts to find herself reflected in the archive. When she was growing up, the main popular reference points for trans femininity were caricatures like Silence of the Lambs. The question becomes, who gets to tell history? What is omitted or invisibilized? Whose efforts and humanity are remembered? Smillie works with STAR's legacy throughout several of her artworks and spoke at length about how the group inspired her with NYU's Trans Oral History Project. There's kind of an interesting full circle moment there with NYU. The Trans Oral History Project is a community archive devoted to the collection, preservation, and sharing of trans histories, allowing trans people to self-represent themselves in the face of narratives made against them. Smillie highlights STAR as the forebearers for the current trans justice organizing that is happening today, which she places in stark contrast with the erasure of trans history and the whitewashing of gay and queer movements. She says, I want the works to challenge the viewer to consider each of our relationships to power. I'm interested in that kind of open-ended invitation that makes space for folks from all kinds of social locations to be able to be critically self-reflexive. And I'm interested in this loving, critical self-reflection as a potentially really powerful political tool. I want to highlight her word choice here of loving critical self-reflection as perhaps another tool for all of us to keep in our resilience toolkit. This artwork mirrors this act of care. Primarily hand-stitched, Smillie worked on the piece for 3 weeks. Across the banner, we can see swaths of black that could easily be interpreted as scars, stretch marks, or wounds, or, as they are in the original source image, shadows. They point to the idea of something ruptured and obscured, but also to ideas of repair and growth. When you look closely, the black fabric is actually lace, a material which could at once suggest femininity and celebration of the feminine, but also mourning as if a veil. Attached to the lace are baubles, including a small pair of wings, which we saw in the previous slide. It's layered over red lettering, a distinct change from the original image, and perhaps a reference to blood. It could also easily be read as a nod to socialism and communism, in addition to the use of the 5-pointed star. The combined Mars and Venus symbol, meant to represent transgender identity, encircles the star. Notably, their rendition of the combined symbol points to a non-dualistic understanding of gender and sexuality, or the necessity of combining forces as women and men, gays and lesbians, etc., literally pointing us towards the path forward. So here you can see an excerpt from, you can see an excerpt from a letter written by Sylvia Rivera, titled Gay Power, When Do We Want It, or Do We? Kind of in a similar echo to the speech that she just gave, where you see that she's kind of almost like mocking up the symbol, which is kind of unique in that it doesn't look like kind of how we have a combined symbol nowadays. The members of STAR were very specific in their positioning and their language. For instance, the use of the term transvestite, which has largely become outdated to refer to transgender or transsexual people. This was a more acceptable term at the time, but it also pointed to the pathologization of transfemininity that STAR was attempting to combat. Likewise, STAR's work was always based on material need. They saw queer liberation and mutual aid as going hand in hand, and their work was always aimed towards revolution, not as a highly lofty ideal, but as the necessary basis for trans dignity and livelihood. In fact, as you can see in that original letter, Starr was first named the Street Transvestites for Gay Power, but they changed it to reflect a more action-oriented stance. In the clip we saw previously of Sylvia Rivera, she lists out the many ways her life had been directly impacted by transphobic violence. She lost housing, jobs, community, and physical safety. These tangible effects of transphobia and homophobia were the reason she and Johnson invested in socialist, labor, and capital redistributive practices in their work. There is a real sense of rescue that comes through in Smiley's recreation of the banner, but also of mending. Perhaps her attempt to suture together old wounds, to give flowers to those who came before her, and to amend the archive with not just their radical work, but also their womanhood and humanity. Rather than simply asking us to remember, she places the banner on the wall, activating it as a protest work, but also confronting us with the clear absence of those who once held it. We too are responsible for keeping this banner aloft.
Yasmin, I think that's a really beautiful transition to this next work, which also references a specific historic moment of protest and the fight for equal access to employment, housing, and other civil rights. I'm going to treat you all to another beautiful installation view with Jean Shin's alterations in the foreground. We have these two pieces by Chiaro Shiota, this beautiful piece by Eva Hesse, and then this next piece we're going to discuss by Theaster Gates. So here we have Civil Rights Throw Rug from the Civil Tapestry series by Theaster Gates. The throw rug, as Gates describes it, is a monochromatic modernist tapestry constructed from decommissioned fire hoses. A throw rug is a decorative object that is at once mundane and utilitarian. And here it is juxtaposed with a potent symbol of the violent resistance civil rights protesters were met with by police and counter-activists. Civil Rights Throw Rug invites us to recall the 1963 Birmingham campaign, organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which sought to integrate Birmingham, Alabama, which Dr. Martin Luther King called, quote, the most segregated city in the country. It began with a boycott of local businesses in order to pressure them to employ people of all races, but also to end public segregation of stores, restaurants, and schools and other public places. The campaign later included marches and sit-ins with people of all ages, including the Children's Crusade, a march in May 1963 of over 1,000 school children organized by Reverend James Bevel. The Birmingham Commissioner of Public Safety, Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, directed police officers to spray the protesters, including children, with fire hoses, set police dogs to attack them, and arrested them. The resulting photographs, such as this one by Charles Moore, spread across the United States and around the globe and caused such outrage that President Kennedy sought to establish civil rights legislation to end legal segregation in Birmingham. And I think this photograph really captures how violent the water coming out of the hoses was. It was enough force to knock people over. And in fact, we had one visitor who grew up in Birmingham and recalled it would actually knock people out of their shoes. In August of 1963, Dr. King led the March on Washington and gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. And 1 month later, in September 1963, the Ku Klux Klan bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was a hub for the civil rights movement in Birmingham. 4 children were killed. Addie Mae Collins, who was 14, Cynthia Wesley, 14, Carol Robertson, 14, and Carol Denise McNair, who was 11. So once again, the fire hoses evoke this violent history, now conjuring the hoses that were used to put out the fire after the bombing. In this context, the piece reminds us of perhaps a mouth crying out in grief. Gates's civil rights throw rug causes us to wonder, is this threat of violence, retribution, and racial animosity part of everyday life? Are the people who braved these acts of violence not also ordinary people forced into extraordinary positions? And for those of us who inherit this legacy of protest, what power does this symbol in history hold? Gates explains that the intent of this series is, quote, seduction, not guilt. The making of these intentionally precise, intentionally seductive things produces offcuts. The nozzles of the hoses feel like some sort of shrapnel. Fire hoses that were used to do great things could actually be some of the most demeaning and horrific weapons used in American history. The caged hose works could be evidence of this past. End quote. It's interesting that Gates refers to them as caged hoses because part of the tension of this artwork is the tension between something that is utilitarian versus symbolic. We are told it's a throw rug, but it's hanging on the wall as an art piece. The fire hoses reference a history of state violence, but formally the piece is very simple, white stripes with a black fringe. The viewer is asked to grapple with these tensions. And the exhibition curator Ganeet Ankori writes, quote, "It seems as if Gates is urging us to look under the rug and never forget the history of the struggle, which is still ongoing." End quote. The resonance of this piece for me is about how art itself can act as protest. And I want to end with this quote from Theaster Gates. "Sometimes the artistic effect is better than policy. It's more complicatedly inclusive than the town hall meeting. There are these ways in which artists can wield the world and make really amazing things happen because they're not just dependent upon the money that can be raised to generate a protest, because the protest is in the work."
I think it's kind of poignant also that we're having this after MLK Day, obviously, and it comes up a lot and for a lot of these artists, this kind of reference to this moment of the civil rights period and drawing on that as a resource. With that, we are actually going to move to the next artist, Della Wells, and this work is titled "The Meeting of Teacup Sisters." Della Wells is a self-taught artist who was born in Milwaukee, who began making art later in life, starting in her 40s. Originally unconvinced that she could be an artist, she was exposed to Black artists via the Gallery Toward Black Aesthetics in Bronzeville as a young adult, and ended up merging her later academic studies in psychology and sociology, women's studies, Africana studies, and her lifelong passion for creative writing into an evocative practice blending collage, painting, and drawing. Like many other artists on view in Fabricated Imaginaries, Wells uses found materials, even having a rule that she can only make works of art from what she finds in her own home. In this work, Wells utilizes collage to call in the craft tradition of quilting. Across the canvas, quilts hang on the clothesline, and their patterns dance freely in the clouds. An older woman watches in the background as the two girls at the front, identified by Wells as sisters, balance porcelain teacups on their heads. Inside each teacup is a small chicken, as if they're having their own meeting. The chickens, for Wells, are often symbols of conflicting emotional states, referencing, unfortunately, an early childhood pet that she would later realize was meant to be food. The teacups, which are also a recurring motif for Wells, reference the history of Black women who would have tea parties to plan political, neighborhood, or church strategies. Whereas in the other works by Wells, the teacups are held, here they seem to be somewhat more precarious. Self-empowerment is vital to Wells's work, stemming from her own experiences growing up, feeling vulnerable and powerless, as well as seeing her own mother struggle with self-agency. Despite her difficult upbringing in early childhood, she draws great inspiration from it. From her mother's stories growing up in North Carolina during Jim Crow segregation, and from the women she was surrounded with. Women who, quote, were strong, women in the church, and activists like Ida B. Wells, writers like Toni Morrison, entertainers like Whoopi Goldberg. For Wells, all of those women represent power. She sees herself as a storyteller as much as an artist, saying, "I've lived through a lot, and history is always repeating itself. I want my work to help people think critically about culture and talk to one another about their stories." Invoking collage and quilting here is especially resonant, as both are art forms which leverage disparate, independent pieces to create pluralistic narratives. In the 2000s, Wells would go on to co-found ABEA, African Americans Beginning to Educate Americans About African American Art, alongside fellow Milwaukee artists in the same spirit of awareness, cultural exchange, and the power of artistic expression. Meeting of Teacup Sisters is actually part of an extensive body of work by Wells, which she calls Mambo Land, a manifestation of childhood fantasies of a different world where Black women rule and are the masters of their own destiny. Mambo references African spirituality, with the title itself being given to head priestesses within diasporic syncretic religions like Voodoo. Through Mambo Land, Wells is able to express her experience living through the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the political climate today. She speaks about the power of fantasy as a way to bridge the gap between our civil ideals and reality. Her particular attention to women's work, quilting, domestic spaces turned into meetings for mutual aid, relationships to the divine and priesthood, is trenchant here and falls in line with a lot of the other artists we've talked about today in their invocation of inspiring matriarchal figures and feminine power, as well as informal organizing practices, community care, and the hope for a better world. For this series, Mambo Land, she actually collaborated with the organization Black Box to create a visual artist statement, which we are pleased to share with you now.
It wasn't until later in my life that I discovered my artistic voice. As a young woman, I was very angry and depressed. Learning about other people's stories helped me to heal. I realized that I was interested in other people's lives, and learning their stories made me a more compassionate person. I created Mambo Land. The Mambo Land women take care of each other, and they are warriors through the sexism, racism, and folks just plain messing with you. In this land, black women rule. I wanted to become a writer to help counter my dysfunctional upbringing. I can shape each element of a story, fairy tales, history. I am Della Wells, and all my life I've been trying to seek my own truth.
And I just want to briefly, before we move on, say thank you to the Beth and Richard Marcus Collection for loaning the Stella Wells piece and also the Theaster Gate civil rights throw rug that we discussed previously.
And
But,
oh,
oh, go
sorry,
ahead.
Maddie. I'll just add that I think that there's something kind of resonant between Della Wells and what the Esther Gates said about kind of artistic expression being this gateway and this entry point for a lot of people. In the video that we just watched, Wells talks about how hearing other people's stories is a way to generate curiosity, compassion, and understanding. And I think that's something that is a through line.
So we wanted to end on an uplifting note. So we decided to end by discussing this permanent installation by the artist Chris Burden called Light of Reason from 2014, which is actually not part of the exhibition Fabricated Imaginaries, but it's always on view. So you see it when you walk into the museum. This piece was commissioned for Brandeis and comprises 3 rows of restored Victorian street lamps and is named for a famous quote by Supreme Court Justice Louis D. Brandeis, which we have on the screen for you. If we would guide by the light of reason, we must let our minds be bold. The 3 rows of street lamps echo the 3 mounds, 3 flames, and 3 Hebrew letters on the Brandeis seal that spell truth, referencing the university's motto, truth even unto its innermost parts. That reminds us that we are called to be truth tellers and to bear witness to history. What does it mean to let our minds be bold? To me, it means we have to imagine and believe in a better world, which is something that art helps us to do.
This also ties into the Jewish cultural tradition of tikkun olam, which refers to various forms of action intended to repair and improve the world. Our hope is that each of these artworks have given you a tool to add to your toolkit for resilience and resistance, whether that is Cave's reminder to be loud and take up space, Gibson's truth-telling and tying of our political selves to a sense of pride and lineage, Smiley's urging us to keep the banner aloft and honor those who fought before us, Gates' stark confrontation of histories of violence, Wells creating a more just world, or Burden's invocation of Louis Brandeis's words. Each of these offer meaningful perspectives that can push us forward and help us resist injustice. And with that, I think that we would love to take any questions that anybody has, or if there's anything that you would like clarification on. We're excited to hear from you all.
And I just want to remind everybody that Fabricated Imaginaries Crafting Art is on view through May 31st. So we encourage you to come to the museum and see these beautiful works in person.
So I see one question from Naomi saying, can you say any more about what Cave means by the statement that his sound suits play a role in social change? So I think you're referring to this quote that I shared earlier, which is really kind of King reflecting more on the experience of seeing the Rodney King video. And he says, that woke my consciousness. That's when I became an artist with a civic responsibility and began to look at my work as a social practice. So I think by that he just means that um, he started to see um, a connection not only between kind of this fear and anxiety that he has, but also a way to kind of create change in the world through his art, um, kind of being born out of that feeling.
And I know that Cave actually did a beautiful public art piece here in Boston. I don't even remember now how many years ago it was. I think it was pre-pandemic, so it might have been 2019 or 2018 with Now and There, that involved like a tremendous community engagement piece. There was that wasn't really sound suits. I mean, it was more of like a building facade, but there was a joy parade and a lot of community involvement with that. So I think there's a big community engagement piece in a lot of his public art as well.
So I also have a question from Darcy. Who was the artist and what was the title of the ground display of round tube-like materials? And I can answer this one. This is Alterations by Jean Shen is the work
Oh,
that you're
right here.
referencing. Yeah, Addie's
And
going
we're
to bring
actually
us
going to have
back.
an artist talk with Jean Shin on April 15th that will also be virtual. So tune in for that. Um, and I want to clarify that if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box below. So don't look for the chat, look for the Q&A.
So I also see a question here. Um, does Cave see his work more as an artwork or as an activist statement? I think he's in many ways marrying his activism with his art making. So I don't know necessarily how he might draw the line there, but that's what I would take from the words of his that we shared.
I think it's interesting because a lot of these art pieces are meant to be in a museum context. So the activism sort of takes place within the walls of the museum and it happens in conversations like the conversation that we're having today, the conversations that we have with visitors, the conversations that we have with students who come and see the work. I think that's the activism that art kind of starts conversations. It allows people to maybe imagine things and feel things outside their own experience. So I think these are all meant to be works of art, but they're meant to be works of art that spark dialogue and create change through that dialogue.
And so we also have a question. How did you um, choose these particular artists? And I think a simple answer to that is that we ran this tour in person, so a lot of the artworks are based off of that original tour, and there we made some shifts to account for the fact that this was a virtual program rather than a live discussion.
And this is all, our work is always predicated on the work of Ganit Ankori, who curated this exhibition, Fabricated Imaginaries Crafting Art. So it's kind of unclear whether the question is like, how did we choose the works for the tour or how did Ganit choose the works for the exhibition? But we have like a limited number of works to choose from because it's the works that are on view that have already been curated for us. So we kind of have a little bit of a easier job in that regard. And we like to choose works that we think are going to start interesting conversations with visitors.
And then I also have a kind of question or clarification from Annie saying that I see that these are works of protest. Which would you say are acts of resistance? I think that's the artworks that are acts of resistance. I think that's a bit hard for us to say it since we aren't the artist, but I do think that we've attempted to kind of show how they see themselves in relationship to civil action and resistance.
And I
Um,
think all of these artworks are actually really personal for each of the artists. So it's kind of the personal practice is kind of resisting something that they've run up against in their lives, and artwork is a way to like work through that and respond to that.
Okay, and then I have, does Della Wells's work come with text like little stories or narratives? That's a really interesting question. The work that we showed does not come with text, but she actually has made children's books, so she's done narrative form illustration. Um, and then I have another question from an anonymous attendee. Do you see the different artworks in dialogue with each other?
Yes, we do. I think that's also something that we were thinking about. The original order that we had for this tour was kind of the order you would take when you would walk through the museum. But then I came in one day and I was like, Yasmin, I think we need to change up the order because we really saw the Tuesday Smiley in conversation with the Astor Gates. We saw the Astor Gates in conversation with Della Wells. We for sure saw the Nick Cave in conversation with Jeffrey Gibson. I mean, there's a lot of linkages. Both, we pointed out that both Nick Cave and Jeffrey Gibson talk about their grandmothers being quilters and those lineages. And then the Della Wells, she collages literal quilts and is talking about that heritage as well. So there's so many, and we could have talked about every piece in the exhibition, kind of, they all really connect and intersect with each other in beautiful ways. So we encourage you to come to the museum and take an in-person tour with us, and we can talk about whichever ones you want.
And I'll also add that even though some of these works aren't in the same gallery space, even between floors, you can see sight lines through that I think were bolstered by the exhibition planning and the curatorial design of the show as well.
Yeah, and that's why we tried to really include installation views so you can kind of see how the pieces are in conversation with each other visually. Like this, the Astor Gates, I love how this kind of oval shape mimics the shape of the Jean Shin alterations. And there are many, many sort of not only abstract or metaphoric connections, but also really beautiful visual connections, which I know Ganit thinks about quite a bit when she's
Hmm.
putting the show together.
And I'll also kind of say to add to the kind of question of how we choose the artists, we were looking for artists who were describing their work in these terms, right? We didn't want to apply to an artist a label that they didn't choose for themselves. Um, also have a question from Colin. Do you ever do tours for middle school students? The answer is absolutely yes. And I'm actually the person that you might want to be in touch with there. So if you would like to, I'll answer you and I'll send you my email so that you can contact me about that.
We actually had a great group of teens from the Waltham Public Library come and tour this exhibition earlier this year, and that was really fun. They loved it. So, and all of our tours are free, and the admission is free, and all of our programs are free. Is that about it? Did we get through our questions?
If there are any last questions, we will take them now.
We just want to say thank you so much for spending your Wednesday evening with us. And we want to encourage you once again to come see Fabricated Imaginaries Crafting Art. It's an absolutely beautiful exhibition. It's so rich and stunning. And it's lucky that there's free admission because you can come back and see it more than once, again and again. And we'll be open until May 31st. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.